Joe, thanks so much. And it's great to be back in Canada after some years. Canada has been such a beacon to us in development on so many issues. R2P, results, multilateralism, and a real commitment historically. So I'm really glad to be here. And when I first started at ODI, the North-South Institute was one of the models that I tried to follow when Roy was in charge. And we had a meeting every year of the OECD think tanks. And I learned such a lot from the fellow directors when I was starting out. So I'm really glad to be back at NSI and to see it under energetic and visionary new leadership. Joe, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try and do 4 things in the next 25 minutes or so. And perhaps somebody would like to move that. Is that a glass or something at the end? Joe, it's yours. I'd like to say, just characterise how development cooperation feels to somebody involved in it today. Something about then, what are the big challenges we face and where is development cooperation going to go? Not in 6 months, not in a year necessarily, but certainly in 5 years. Illustrate that by talking a little bit about climate change, which is something I'm now working on a lot. And then come back to what are the implications for what those of us who care passionately about development cooperation will be doing in the future. This is my Halloween quiz for the day, is to be able to identify all these people. I meant to buy a bar of chocolate, but I see there are plenty of slices of cake at the back for anybody who can identify all these people without mistakes. Anybody know who this is? Or this one? Answers on a postcard. This is a group of ministers. As it happens, more by design, accident than design, they're mostly of the centre-right rather than the centre-left, without naming names or trying to pigeonhole individuals. And there is an alliance of these new ministers who call themselves the Blue Group and have shared preoccupations. Some of those are driven politically by where they come from, and quite a lot of them are driven by the circumstances in which they find themselves. And I suppose I think it's not surprising that a large number of ministers everywhere are worried about how they sustain public support for development at a time when budgets are under huge pressure, and when schools or hospitals are being closed and aid programs are either the same or being increased. I know you're largely insulated from these fiscal and economic pressures in Canada because your country has been such a success in terms of sustaining GDP and managing the fiscal crisis. I was going to say largely, but partly as a result of the work of Mark Carney, and congratulations for that. But everywhere else, GDP is stagnating, budget deficits are large and rising, and it's really hard. So what do ministers do in that circumstance? First of all, they absolutely focus on delivering results. They have to be able to say to people, almost to the point of saying, here are the names and addresses of the children who are now in school or who are being sustained through vaccination programs, who would not have had those benefits if you had not paid your tax pounds, dollars, or whatever. So a really strong focus on results. And we have a whole conversation about results, which is to try and move beyond that very narrow definition and try and make people think about institutional change and governance and long-term development results. I call that results 2.0 rather than 1.0, but you can understand why they feel that. And it leads them to a number of different perspectives. First of all, they love vertical initiatives. We had the replenishment of Gavi in London in the summer. David Cameron got a standing ovation. When did a Prime Minister last get a standing ovation for committing many hundreds of millions of dollars to somebody overseas? This was a great triumph for Andrew Mitchell, but also for David Cameron, demonstrating that aid works. Very strong focus on growth, which you would expect from this group of ministers, and on working with business and the private sector. They describe it as newer than it is, really, because certainly in Europe this has been a theme since about the mid-2000s. There was a period when Downing Street used to describe DFID as the big NGO down the road and being on a completely different agenda to what was happening in what the grown-ups were doing, so to speak, in Downing Street. But now most people are talking about agriculture and growth, and 2012 is going to be the year of sustainable energy, so lots of people are talking about energy as a key priority. That's certainly true of Andris Piebalgs, who is the EU Development Commissioner. The biggest aid donor in the world, $1 billion a month from Brussels, more than the World Bank in ODA and more than the whole of the UN. The whole of the UN comes out of Brussels, and it's kind of one of the biggest secrets in the development world, really. Lots of attention to resilience because of the food shocks and the financial crisis and the increasing wave of humanitarian crises, floods in Pakistan, for example, earthquakes in Haiti and other places. A strong focus, partly because of the need to satisfy the public, on governance, and tied to that a new emphasis on conditionality, which is kind of a surprise because we spent so many years fighting conditionality. But if you look at the new EU policy published the other day, budget support has been relabeled as a contract with developing country governments, and there are strict conditions which have to be fulfilled on the developing country side for that contract to be maintained around human rights, accountability, transparency, and so on. These ministers mostly prefer bilateral over multilateral because it's an easier sell, I think, to their publics. And none of these is exactly new, but they do characterize a slightly different way of doing aid, and I'll come back to some of those differences in a second. They bring all this together under the umbrella of aid effectiveness, and Busan is, of course, going to be the pilgrimage center for many people working in development in a few weeks' time when they come together for the next high-level forum on aid effectiveness. And these are the chapter headings of the Busan outcome document as it currently stands. There's a third draft available on the internet. And all these themes I've been talking about are there: ownership, transparency, resilience, private sector development, corruption, and so on, and a couple of other things like climate change finance that we'll come back to. I think the people who are leading the Busan process are competent and visionary and are trying to work a very difficult balance between the interest of the DAC countries and the non-DAC donors and the developing countries. It is a fairly bland document as it stands, and it will be interesting to see whether or not the ministers are able to inject a little bit more specificity into it when they get to Korea in a few weeks' time. Hillary Clinton is going. That will certainly raise the game. I learned the other day that Tony Blair is probably going to give a speech. So there will be quite a lot of high-level political attention on Busan when the time comes. Some things that are not likely to be discussed at Busan, for example, aid volumes in any detail. There's a rather general statement in there at the moment about meeting our commitments. Most of our commitments at the moment seem to be reducing aid rather than increasing it, with one or two shining exceptions. It's kind of nice to be British in the aid world at the moment because there has been an unshakable commitment to maintain progress towards 0.7. So is that it? Is that what we have to offer the world in terms of our narrative on development cooperation? A series of global poverty challenges, a targeted aid response which is efficient and accountable and demonstrates to the people who pay for it that it delivers results. I think it isn't. I think we have a job to do, and ministers have a job to do, to change the narrative on development, to be more forward-looking and to think about what the challenges are that we might face in the future. To introduce that discussion, let me show you this graph, which is an attempt to suggest that well-being in developing countries, using well-being in a kind of generic sense to mean the good things that people seek, but it could also be, by the way, developed countries, is dependent, mediated by all these capability-type terms like income and health and education and inclusion and participation, by two sets of policies. On the left, we have the national poverty environment, which is shaped in turn by public expenditure and by the regulatory environment. Most of what we do in development, most of what that previous set of slides about the aid agenda was concerned with, are about this side of the table. We worry about whether countries are committed, whether they have public expenditure frameworks, whether they have their policies right. That's what I've done for 40 years. That's what a number of you have done, although probably for less looking around the table than 40 years. At the same time, though, governments need to worry about the things which are on the right-hand side, which are the international drivers which shape the economy and the society globally in which they make a living. And if you have all of this right, but something goes wrong here, you can find yourself set back. And indeed, a fascinating conversation around the time of the last British election was the Labour Party trying to say that all the problems we had in the international economy were what were causing our fiscal crisis. It was all the fault of the subprime crisis. And the Conservative Party saying actually it was all the fault of profligacy by the Labour government. And I'm not going to take sides on that while I'm being filmed anyway. And so we have all these things which are sometimes called global public goods, but which is just as easy to think about as the things we need to fix. Let me deal with a couple of aspects of that. First of all, just to go back to the left-hand side for a second. It's a remarkable fact that there aren't that many low-income countries left. And for those of us who work in development, where our primary concern has been with poor countries, you look into the future and it's as if you're running a shop selling specialized equipment and the number of potential customers is going down every day. In 2003, there were 61 low-income countries. In 2011, there were only 40. And that number is set to decline very rapidly. So all sorts of places where we have made our living for 40 years, Ghana, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam even, are all either now or about to become middle-income countries. Now, lots to say about middle-income countries, of which the number is increasing quite rapidly. Including the fact that the divisions between these categories are relatively arbitrary and a little bit debated. But, the bottom line is that aid does lots of things, but the main thing it does is transfer money from one set of countries to another set of countries. Of course, it transfers knowledge and it creates partnerships and it's a vehicle for opening new forms of economic exchange. But in the end, aid is money. Middle-income countries, almost by definition, don't need money. India is sitting on foreign exchange reserves of 250 billion or so. A sharp difference, of course, from where it was in 1990 before liberalisation began. And it has an aid programme of its own, has just committed $5 billion to Africa over the next 3 years. So in the UK, I don't know whether you have this conversation in Canada, a big discussion has been, why on earth would we give money to India? We might do other things in India, but why on earth would we give them money? And it's certainly possible to see that within 5 years we won't be giving them money. And the same is true of a large number of other countries. There is a conversation, of course, about whether or not people should be discriminated against because if they're poor and live on one side of the border in a low-income country, they get aid, but if they live on the other side of the border, they don't. And is that fair? Actually, I think it probably is fair. And I describe this as the poor people in Saudi Arabia problem. There are poor people in Saudi Arabia. Do we have an aid program in Saudi Arabia? No, we don't. But we have other things that we might try to do to help poor people in Saudi Arabia. So this is a huge topic for all of us in the development business, is the rapid rise of middle-income countries. Of these low-income countries, quite a lot are fragile states, where it's actually rather difficult to spend money. So you've got three categories of countries. You've got middle-income countries that don't need money, fragile states where you can't spend money, and Tanzania. And this is kind of a challenge for us in development, is how we cope with this side of the equation. What do we do when actually money is not the problem, but we do care about poverty? That's kind of the left-hand side of the chart. And we could talk more about that, but I really want to focus on the other side of the chart, which is the things we need to fix globally. And this is a kind of almost random list. I have lots of other slides about all these things, but they illustrate a problem, I think, which is that, if you look outside the window, the forest fires are burning all around the horizon on some of these topics. And some of them are really urgent. It was fascinating to be at CG in Waterloo over the weekend, where for a large part of the conversation, the only topic of conversation was the euro crisis. And was the euro crisis going to tip the world into a new recession, which, of course, last time had really serious knock-on effects on growth prospects in developing countries. No country is an island. Even islands are not islands in this respect. And one of the complaints I make about the G20 is that it divides the conversation into two parts. You've got the grown-ups talking about the Financial Stability Board and bank regulation and what have you. And then there's the development agenda, which is all about poverty and infrastructure. Actually, the core macroeconomic agenda is a development agenda. Those other things matter as well, but developing countries need to be at the table when exchange rates and global imbalances and all these other things are discussed. If we don't find a way of managing global growth so that it benefits everybody, then clearly we are going to be in some trouble. And there are many other issues, I'm going to come back to climate change, of this kind, where progress in developing countries risks being thrown off course, or to turn the coin the other way up, there are huge opportunities for developing countries if we manage all these things properly. And we could come back to one or two of these later, like food security, which I feel very passionately about, and where I think the current global food crisis is rather being mishandled. This is the future development agenda. And when ministers, as they do in this blue group, talk about development being important because it's a moral imperative, but also because it benefits us, this is the range of issues that they're talking about. Andrew Mitchell in my country talks about the importance of development because he cares about poverty reduction, which he does, actually, but also because if we don't fix terrorism and financial stability and climate change, we will lose in the UK. And I'm sure the same is true in Canada. Even a country as prosperous and successful as Canada is not immune from these external challenges. I want to illustrate then where this agenda leads us by taking the example of climate change. And many of you will be much more familiar with the climate change issues than I am, and I'm not going to give a long analysis of it, but just a couple of things on the projections. And the important thing to note about this chart is that the bars, which represent the median projections, have a bigger bar at the top than they do at the bottom. In other words, the risk and uncertainty about climate change is much more on the upside than the downside. We know it's not going to be much better than this, but it could be a lot worse. And in the climate change circles now, a lot of people are saying, off the record and many on the record, that 2 degrees has become a vain hope, that we should think about adjusting to a world of 4-degree warming, which, if you go back to the Stern report, has pretty catastrophic implications and does take some thinking about. Now, conventionally, climate change is discussed in 2 circles. On the left, a mitigation circle, which, crudely speaking, is about windmills and nuclear power stations, and on the right-hand side, an adaptation circle, which is largely about dikes and mangrove swamps and worrying about extreme weather events. We've added, in the work that we're doing in the Climate and Development Network, which I chair, a focus on development strategies, not for the obvious reason that it is important to think about the impact of mitigation and adaptation on poor people, but because climate change and the actions we take to deal with climate change challenge the whole way in which the world economy works. There will be great transformations in what is produced and where it's produced and the price at which it's produced and on who gains and who loses as that transition is made. It's really important for us to make sure that developing countries are not left standing on the sidelines while the economic transformation takes place. And I have 1 or 2 examples, although not necessarily all on slides, to illustrate different aspects of this. First of all, this is a graph which frightens the life out of me, and I thought had been superseded, but I see is in the latest Uganda adaptation plan. On the left, you've got where coffee can be grown in Uganda at today's temperature, and on the right, you've got where coffee can be grown if temperatures go up by 2 degrees. And as you can see, coffee virtually disappears from the map of Uganda. Anybody who's been in Uganda knows just how important coffee is to the economy and to employment and to welfare in Uganda. Now, it may be possible to develop heat-resistant varieties and so on, and it may not. And if you were running Uganda, so to speak, if you were President Museveni, you'd want to have this on your office wall as probably the most serious single challenge facing your country over the next generation. If not coffee, then what? And how do you make that work for you? Here's another example. And I love this one because it enabled me to give a talk that I hope was quite challenging at the Asian Development Bank last year. The Asian Development Bank has been funded by DFID to apply a growth diagnostics framework developed by people like Houseman and Roderick, and it works through what the key constraints on growth are. And they did a number of them, and one of the ones it was Nepal. And what the growth diagnostic on Nepal says is this is a really poor country. It's poorer now than Bangladesh and India. It's fallen a long way behind. It has very low formal sector employment. One of the key constraints on formal sector employment is the lack of energy. Oh, hydro. You know, mountains, lakes, rivers. We could do something with hydro in Nepal and we could transform the energy situation, and that would create formal sector employment, and that would be good for growth. Here on the right, when you Google climate change and Nepal, this comes out quite quickly. Development and climate change in Nepal focus on water resources and hydropower. Recommendation number one, whatever you do in Nepal, don't invest in large-scale hydro. Because large-scale hydro is highly susceptible to glacial melt and flash floods and depletion of rivers. This is a high-risk, low-return strategy which will cause you great damage if climate change becomes even more severe. So you have two very reputable pieces of work which tell you precisely the opposite conclusion. And it's just an illustration of how, if you don't think seriously about the transformatory nature of climate change, you can end up in great difficulty. Not everything is negative. This is a picture of the Uyuni salt flats in Bolivia between La Paz and Potosi. Underneath these salt flats are something like $3 trillion worth of reserves of lithium. Electric cars are the future. Cars need batteries. Batteries need lithium. Bolivia is described as the new Saudi Arabia of the green growth era. Not just, of course, mining and selling the lithium, but developing the battery industry and all the downstream jobs that will go with it. This is not about mitigation in Bolivia, and it's not about adaptation in Bolivia. It's about Bolivia having the opportunity to seize a new market and to develop a whole new industry. There's a solar company I track in China called Renes Solar, which last year produced 1 gigawatt of solar panels. It's $1.5 billion business. Every single gigawatt was exported. This is the German and French solar industry run or produced in China. This is not mitigation in China. It's not adaptation in China. It's actually China seizing a global opportunity. Schumpeter hangs over this whole discussion, creative destruction. The phrase that's often used is disruptive innovation. How do countries manage the disruptive innovation that will be associated with climate change? In Denmark, they've just declared the most progressive, the most advanced climate targets in the world. Complete decarbonisation by 2050. Complete decarbonisation of everything except transport by 2035. Korea, another one. Very ambitious green growth targets. Both of them focused on being at the cutting edge of new industries, creating competitive advantage by investing in these new industries, even without a global deal. And this, for me, is an absolutely vital piece of thinking about development in the future. I can just imagine a situation in which many poor countries are just left behind by this and are lost as new technologies increase efficiency and reduce costs. We need to rethink, first of all, our adaptation strategies. Resilience, a key theme of the DFID Humanitarian Response Review, but lots of work going on around the system on adaptation. And we need to rethink our growth strategies. Just to take one example, everybody's read Paul Collier's The Bottom Billion. One of the things Paul Collier often says is that the route out of poverty for African countries is to invest in growth poles on the coast, which are connected to global markets. And I think that's great. And then I think to myself, hang on a minute, the coast, this is potentially, you're going to have to think about climate resilience of the harbours and the industrial estates and so on. And then who knows what climate change policies will do to trade? What happens if they put a carbon tax on bunker fuel or on aviation fuel? We've just put air freight into the emissions trading scheme in Europe, for example. Who knows what that will do to the location and the opportunities of production. Potentially, this is like putting an additional tariff, and depending on how high the carbon price is, the tariff could be quite substantial. Right, so this is all... sorry, one more thing on this. As we think about that transformation, and this is a climate change slide rather than a more general slide, one of the key things we have to manage is the governance and the politics. I don't know what it's like in Canada. In Europe, climate change is a phenomenally difficult issue. And there are a number of reasons for that. Tony Giddens has written a book on the politics of climate change. And he says that Giddens' paradox is that people won't do anything about climate change until it's right in front of their eyes, and by that time it's too late. Because if you don't act early, you can't take the steps you need in order to manage climate change. I thought if Tony Giddens can have a paradox, I can have a paradox. And my paradox is that you need consensus, long-term regulatory frameworks, for example, on exactly the things that are hardest to get agreement on, because there are so many vested interests and differences of perspective on these issues. And when you hear British, we went to hear Ed Miliband speak when he was climate minister. And he gave a relatively, he gave a good speech, but a speech about how we needed to tackle climate change. There was uproar in the room. You can't stop poor people going on holiday to Mallorca. You can't keep building rail links through my back garden. You know, if you raise the price of electricity, people will die of cold. All people will die of cold. Each of these things is bitterly and deeply contested. It's really difficult. How do you build a national consensus, and what role do think tanks play in that? How do you manage international negotiations? We have lots and lots of people working on the politics of now middle-income countries in Africa. Lots and lots of social anthropologists working on the marriage customs of tribals in far countries. How many anthropologists are working on the marriage customs and cultures of the members of the General Assembly or the UNFCCC? How many of our people are running game theory on how to get a deal out of the climate change negotiations? This has huge implications for how we manage development in the future. And as I say, climate change is an illustration. We could talk about all the other little bubbles on my chart as well. Now that leads me to some conclusions, and I'm nearly finished, about the implications for development cooperation in the future, which different ministers see in different ways. When Douglas Alexander was our Secretary of State, I think he was very much on the right-hand side of this chart and used to talk about DFID needing more head and less body. More people who can go out across government and fewer people who are expert in running sector programs in Malawi. I think if we look not 6 months, not a year, but maybe 5 years ahead, we'll have less work on poverty, more work on global public goods. We'll be working less in poor countries, more trying to work on partnerships on global public goods in middle-income countries. We'll have fewer people working on aid, more people working on policy. We'll need fewer aid departments as we do this, and aid agencies will need more international development departments working across government in the way that DFID does. We won't be working so much on single ministry programs, but we'll have plans and programs which cut across the whole of government. For example, the EC has a strategy for the Horn of Africa. And it has, of course, EC has no shortage of strategies, but it has one for the Horn of Africa, which is about how you link aid policy, migration policy, trade policy, and security policy across those various things. I think we'll be less bilateral and more multilateral. I think we ought to be less bilateral today and more multilateral, but I think inevitably the characteristic of all these big new challenges is that they can only be solved by multilateral action, and that the scope for bilateral room for manoeuvre is limited. I suspect we'll be having less government-to-government engagement and far more public-private partnerships, and also a big role for civil society partnerships, especially in middle-income countries. And I think we won't be talking about aid effectiveness so much, because as climate finance grows, there will be a much bigger role of climate finance is not aid, it's an entitlement. So we'll be talking about entitlement and partnership and the governance of new aid architecture modalities. These are not trivial, these changes. Actually, these are rather significant changes. And I want to finish with the implications they have for the people who manage, quote, aid, quote, development agencies or ministries. there aren't that many words in the dictionary that begin with sp. But anyway, spring, spigot, spoon or spanner is the framework I use for talking to development ministers and their senior staff about how to shape their agencies in the future. If you go back 20 years, I don't know about Canadian aid, but certainly DFID and the World Bank were full of people who knew how to build bridges and dams and power stations and what have you. The engineers, the spanners, were very important people. They had a seat at the top table. If in 1970 or 80 you wanted to make a good career in development, you would do an engineering degree and then join the aid agency and you would be set for life. Except that we changed our priorities. By the late 1990s and early 2000, you needed to have a different degree to be successful. Your best bet was to become a health sector or agriculture sector specialist, or a PRSP planner, a poverty planner, and to understand how to deliver public services directly to poor people. Then we decided that actually budget support was the way forward, and so actually we fired all those people who knew about health and education, and we hired accountants and public finance people whose job was to know when to turn the spigot on and off, and the spigot is dripping budget support into countries. The accountants get the new Land Rovers, the fastest computers, the air conditioning in the treasury. They never need to leave the office because all they do is pore over spreadsheets. They've had a great innings. Now in the future, I used to use a spyglass for this because it was about looking overseas to the multilaterals, but it didn't seem active enough. So searching the dictionary for words that begin with spur, I found spring on a pogo stick. And this is about really making things happen through the multilateral agencies. So the people who know about the marriage customs of the General Assembly or the UNFCCC, the people who can understand about how to manage international negotiations or broker global deals in other ways, how to manage a global food crisis, are the people that are needed. And I remember the permanent secretary of DFID 10 years ago or so saying to me, I don't have enough people to send around Whitehall. I think that's changed. DFID is now very active on the National Security Council, for example, dealing with, of course, Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and all the other places where we're engaged. And those are the new skills that are needed. And that is a big challenge to people who manage these issues. So to go back to the beginning, we do have an urgent aid agenda, and aid effectiveness is not a trivial matter. And there are steps, and we could talk about what has to be done to improve the use, the value, the volume, the quality of aid. But over and above that, there is a new agenda which we neglect at our peril. Because if we don't sort out climate change and the food crisis and trade and the global economy, then it won't just affect millions and millions of poor people in developing countries. It will come back to bite us. And development cooperation is, if you like, itself a public good which benefits all. And that's what we need to work on because we're not there yet. And think tanks, just a final sentence, for me, ODI and NSI and all our many compatriots and comrades around the world have an absolutely crucial role to play in developing the narratives and messaging them and helping ministers who are faced with all these constraints to tell a coherent and enthusing story to their publics. Thank you.